Good morning. Sorry, this thing is moving around. Okay, can y'all hear me okay? We're ready. Ethan, we ready? Okay. Good morning again. I was not running behind getting here, but just running behind getting things done because my right hand person, Caitlin, is sick today. So had to call in Ethan and some other people to help me with tech. Even though they've trained me in tech 400 times, I still forget how to do things. So there's a lot of buttons back there. A lot of buttons. I couldn't get this screen to come up for the PowerPoint. So thanks to Ethan. He already left because he knew I was going to embarrass him, so he left. Okay. Well, every Tuesday when I get here, I'm shocked that y'all came back. I feel like last week we had so much information, and we had talked about like looking at the top mountain peaks. And last week I sort of dipped into some lower mountain peaks, and I gave you lots and lots of information. So my promise today is to not do that. So we are going to finish the Old Testament today. Woo! Yay! And we are going to finish the last three periods of the Old Testament, and y'all will be bobsledders in the Old Testament. You will know, hopefully, more than you knew 4 weeks ago. Okay, so let's see, what else? Oh, I know what I was going to say. I was going to say, the things I said about my sister and my mother last week, I didn't intend. It wasn't written down. I just said them, and I went back and listened to them on the recording. And but I appreciate so many of you wrote me emails and wrote me notes and called me or texted me, and it meant a lot to me, and prayed for me. My friend Georgita prayed for me afterwards, and just the things that that my family has walked through the past 4 months, 5 months. And your support and just your kind words meant a lot to me. And when I started talking about bipolar depression, later I realized maybe some of you suffer with that, or someone in your family, or someone that you love, or one of your children, or maybe even you yourself have been diagnosed with that. And my sister this was back in the like the 70s. My sister didn't immediately get all the help and care that she needed from healthcare professionals. And so for her struggle was long and hard, but it doesn't mean that it has to be that way. There's, her medications that she took, there were more and more new medications that were coming out every year that really helped her in her journey and her fight with mental illness. And I talked about my mom, and I said I learned a lot from my mom, and all I said was she told me to wear lipstick. That's not good. My mother taught me a lot more than that. She gave me, now my parents, neither one of my parents were, their faith was not center point in their life. If you judge that by church attendance, which you don't, but my dad never darkened the door of a church building unless I was doing something at church, like the youth choir was singing or we were doing something, he would come to that. But he was one of the best men I ever knew. And my mom did get very involved in her church. Like after we grew up and moved away, my mother her faith became more important to her in her journey in her older age. But when I was thinking about the things that my mom taught me, other than wearing lipstick and a slip under my dress, she gave me a love for nature, a love for the creation. My mother was a big outdoors person. She was an athlete. She was an all-state basketball player, and she was 5'2". Yes. She is an amazing athlete. She gave me my love for basketball and for all sports. My mother gave me that. My mother was a champion of the food insecure. Anyone that she knew didn't have enough to eat, my mother was there providing for them. My mother in the 70s was a civil rights activist in our little small town in Alabama. I learned from her in that. I learned from my mother how to give back, how to just give whatever you have. my mother was always giving. There was a woman in our community, her name was Sherry. Her name still is Sherry. And my mother always saved things for Sherry. Once a month, Sherry would come by the house, and Sherry had a daughter who was mentally challenged and physically challenged and would never leave home. She would always need care, and my mother always had things for Sherry and her family. So she would have a box in her bedroom, and she'd put things in them for Sherry, clothing, magazines, books that she had read, I don't know what, anything. And Sherry would come by once a month and visit with Mother and collect her box of things from my mom, and Sherry loved my mother. And my mother had a very strong personality and said what she thought a lot. I heard a lot of that. And Sherry did too. She would tell Sherry she needed to lose 50 pounds. She would tell Sherry these things, but Sherry kept coming back because my mother was such a giver of advice, even if Sherry didn't want it, but she was also a giver of overflow in her own life. And just a few days before my mother died, Sherry came to the door and I let her in. I did not let visitors in because I wouldn't want anybody to come visit me in that state of my life, you know. But I let Sherry come in, and she prayed over my mom. And I stood in the kitchen and I recorded it on my phone because and I cried and Sherry cried. And so those are the kind of things my mom taught me and helped like mold me into being a more giving person, a champion of those who have less than I do, and also a lover of nature and sports and all those great things. So, and she instilled that in all of us. And my mother did not like teach me things. She didn't say, come in here and we'll teach you how to cook, you know, unfortunately. But she taught me things by her example. And that was really special in my life. And I was going to mention one of those, and now it left me. So, well, she taught me humor. My mother was funny. So was my father. My mother didn't try to be funny, but she just said things. For example, I didn't plan to say this either, but one of the things that my mother said to me, she called me on my birthday. This was, 15 years ago. And I knew it was Mother. She didn't understand cell phones and caller ID and all that, you know. And so I answered the phone. I knew it was her. And she didn't, usually she said, hey, this is your mom, or something like that. Well, I know it's you because it says it here, you know. And then it was my birthday. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning. She called me and she said, I remember this day like it was yesterday. Your dad was driving me to the hospital. And I turned to him and I said, my life is going to be better after the birth of this child. And then she said, oh, wait, no, that was your brother. So she didn't mean it to be funny, but that's the kind of things. She gave me great stories like that, and it probably was my brother, because, yes. The only other piece of advice she gave me was never, ever, ever marry a coach. And my brother is a high school football coach, so she loved it that my brother was a coach, but she said never for me to marry a coach. I don't know why. Or an insurance person. I don't know why. This was my mother's, this was her opinion. Anyway, she brought a lot of stuff into my life, the good and, iron sharpening iron. You know, like I said last week, relationships, daughter-mother relationships aren't always the smoothest, and neither was my relationship with my mother. But in our older years, all we did was just laugh together. So that was fun. I miss laughing with her. Okay, so we have some questions from last week. Some really good questions. One, I think, was dropped in the box, and like I said last week, I'm not that organized, and I found it in my stack of stuff. The location of the Garden of Eden, it says, this is a great question, wouldn't the Garden of Eden been totally destroyed in the flood? My understanding in modern day Tigris and Euphrates is not the Tigris and Euphrates of Genesis. I've never heard that, but it makes sense. They are simply named after the Tigris and Euphrates of Genesis. The answers in Genesis explains this well. There are a few articles in regard to this question. So yes, the Garden of Eden, I didn't mean the beautiful, perfect Garden of Eden, we don't know, was destroyed. It was destroyed by the flood, just not sure exactly where it is on the map. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates. The current Tigris and Euphrates is where most people label it on the map. So just a little side note there. And this is a great question. During the plagues, God repeatedly hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not relent. In the end, Pharaoh died sinful with a hardened heart. It seems like he wasn't given the chance for forgiveness. Am I interpreting that correctly? So my answer to that is we really don't know, what God did in Pharaoh's heart after the Hebrews left Egypt. God could have done a mighty work in his heart. We don't really know, but the fact that he wasn't given a chance for forgiveness, we don't know that he was not given a chance for forgiveness because everything, it's not recorded. And then another really great question, BC before Christ and AD is after death. Is this true? Well, sort of. BC can stand for before Christ, but the AD is Anno Domini. How do you say that? Domini. It means the year of our Lord. So I had to ask the bobsledder this question because it's very confusing. So he just said there was two different calendars. Calendars were used, and probably Jesus was actually born around 5 BC. So it's not like the day Jesus died, we started this calendar. And then later, the Christian calendar was adapted. There were two different calendars at the time. Most of you bobsledders out there probably know more about that than I do. But AD doesn't mean like when Jesus died, the calendar started then. So good questions. I hope that's all of them. I don't hope that you don't have any more questions, but I hope I didn't miss any questions. I hope I didn't miss any questions. Yes. Yeah, that didn't come out right. Yeah. Ask all the questions you want. The cards are back there. There's some cards in your notebook. If you don't have any, there's some cards back there. Ask them. I love the questions. It makes me study more. Okay, so turn in your notebooks to page 40. We just finished the Judges period and the Kingdom period. So now we're going to start the exile period, 722 BC. And like I said, I'm going to touch the mountaintops in these. We're not going deep into all the details. You're going to have time. You got a lot of discussion questions on your table as we walk through the periods, but we did start about 7 minutes late. Okay, so let's walk through. Let's read off. I don't have the slide because I accidentally asked Ethan to delete some slides, and I told him to delete one and it had all this on it. Sorry, it's not Ethan's fault, it's my fault. So let's walk through the period, the person, the place, until we get to the exile period. And you can find that on page 40, and you can fill it out in your head, and you can fill it out on your paper as you have time. So I just want you to say it and repeat it and just go all the way down the list. Ready? Creation. And the father of faith. Exile. Moses. Eat. Rebellious for 400 years. All right, let's read the exile. Exile, Daniel, Babylonia. Daniel encourages the exiles to trust God and be faithful during the 70 years of exile. I do have this. Sorry. Well, all right, there it is. Okay, so on page 40, we'll start there. Turn the page till you see we're going to probe deeper, and we're going to look at the 4 main subjects of the exile period. During the time of the exile, I'm reading from the top of page 40. During the time of the exile, there were some great spiritual leaders, and there was repentance on the part of a segment of the Jewish people. However, this did not remove the penalty for years of rebellion, and the full price of the exile was exacted. Okay, so when we left the kingdom period, the area had divided because of bad leadership. We talked about how many righteous kings were there in the northern kingdom? None. How many righteous kings were in the southern kingdom? That's right, 6 or 8. The northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by Assyria. We talked about this last week. Assyria comes in and conquers the northern kingdom, and that was in 722 BC. And last week I said they disappeared into Assyria. I didn't mean they vanished, like something on Harry Potter. They assimilated into the Assyrian culture and sort of became part of them. They intermarried. And on a side note, those Assyrians the northern kingdom people that were conquered by Assyria, in the New Testament, those people were called the Samaritans. They were half Jew, half Gentile. Okay, so there were no good kings in the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom fared better. And they lasted 400 years, which is 136 years longer than the northern kingdom. Remember that the southern kingdom had that cycle. They sinned, they repented, they were delivered. They did it again. They sinned, they repented, they delivered. It was wash, rinse, and repeat over and over and over for 7 cycles. And so during that time, God sent prophets to warn Judah. Said, if you don't straighten up, then, and he told them what would happen. So if you look at that chart on page 5, that little chart that I got from Max Anders in his 30 Days to Understanding the Bible, if you look at the prophets to Judah, look at the prophetical books, the prophets that prophesied to the southern kingdom of Judah were these books: Habakkuk, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Micah, Zephaniah, Lamentations, and then Ezekiel and Daniel prophesied also in the 2 Kings. Okay, so Jeremiah was one of those prophets that were prophesying to Judah, the southern kingdom. And he told them they're going to be taken into captivity. You're going to be taken into captivity. Warning, warning, red light. You're going to be taken into captivity, and it's going to last for 70 years if you don't straighten up. And they didn't heed the warning, and they kept living the life that they were living. And Jeremiah became the weeping prophet. Have you ever heard that Jeremiah was the weeping prophet? He cried over Judah. He loved Judah. He cried over their impending captivity. And he wrote all about that in the book of Lamentations, if you want to read that. Jeremiah said that because of the sin of Judah, now remember, the northern kingdom's gone, the southern kingdom's still surviving, but because of their sin, God was going to send judgment through the Babylonians. And guess what? That's what happened. The Babylonians came, they were captured, and they were in exile for 70 years. This is under point 1, prophecy, warning of impending captivity found in Jeremiah. Judah had closed their ears to Jeremiah. They hated Jeremiah. They threw him in this pit. He sunk down in the mud. He had to be rescued. People had to suck him up out of the mud. But they did not listen to Jeremiah. And so they were exiled for 70 years. And, same for us. When we're rebelling against God, when there's sin in our lives, it affects our relationship with Him. We're not exiled from Him. We are in Him. The new covenant, we are in Him, and He is in us. But forgiveness is at the core of our faith. But even in our sin, sometimes there's consequences, as it was for Judah. They suffered the consequences of the life they were living. I read this story about a man who decided that his life, he'd been a bad guy, and he decided he was going to end his life. And so he climbed to the tallest building that he could, and he jumped. And as he was free falling, he thought, this was not a great idea. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. So he cried out to God, God, forgive me for everything I've done, and forgive me from jumping from this building and ruining my life. And God said, don't think a thing of it. I'll never mention it again, but I'll see you in a minute. So although our sins are forgiven, there's consequences. All right, so number 2, the prophets. The prophets they're in exile now. So the prophets Ezekiel and Daniel encouraged the faithfulness of the exile. So they were all exiled. Not everyone in Judah left. Some of the poorest stayed back behind. And Ezekiel wrote what was going to happen to Judah. Now, the book of Ezekiel is not autobiographical. It's more direct prophecy. He warned them about the current judgment that was coming, and they didn't listen to him either. And Daniel was one of the prophets during this time that encouraged the faithfulness of the exiled. Great stories about Daniel you can read in his book. His book is more biographical. He had his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They stood firm in their beliefs. There's many examples of Daniel encouraging the faithfulness of the exiles, and he did it by the example that he lived and his example of faith. That's how he encouraged the exiles. And number 3, the exiles themselves are assimilated into the culture. So Daniel showed them how to live in this culture. When we're displaced, we have to learn how to live, or we go travel somewhere, we learn how to live in the culture that we're at. And that's what Daniel did. Because of his obedience to the law, he stood fast to his beliefs, and he became important. He became indispensable to them because of his wisdom. He showed them how to live under hard times. So they were assimilated into the culture. The Babylonians were evil, murderous, brutal people. And Daniel was an example to them to how to live within that evil, how to live in that culture without the culture living in you. Okay, and then the power change. See how fast we're going through this? The power change. The Persian Empire expands. This is in the book of Daniel. Okay, if you remember, like we said earlier, the northern kingdom was conquered by who? And the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by who? Okay, so now the Babylonians, they're all mixed together there. The Babylonians are captured by the Persians. So the Persian Empire expands. The kings of Persia were Cyrus and Darius. And so now they rule over all these empires. Persia not only ruled their own land, but also the lands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, once owned by them. The empire went from the Tigris all the way to the Mediterranean. That was the Persian Empire, humongous landmass that was now ruled by the Persian. It was a vast empire. And another side note, the Babylonians are now the Iranians, and the Persians are Iranians, the Babylonians are the Iraqis, and both countries are enemies of the United States now. But the Muslims, those are Muslim countries now. Muslim came on the scene when Muhammad came on the scene in 800 AD. What's miraculous about that area now, it's closed to the gospel pretty much, but there's people there are missionaries that are there, and Muslims and people in that area are coming to Christ in ways that we don't see here in America, in miraculous, supernatural ways. Great stories. So everything stays that way, the Persian Empire, until the Greeks come on the scene later, and then the Romans. We'll get to that. All right, so we finished the exile period. Whoop. Okay, let's look at the map. They're living in exile. It's for 70 years, just like Jeremiah said they would. All right, the map on page 42, draw a line from Babylonia toward Assyria and circle Assyria. Babylonia captured Assyria. Then draw another line from Persia toward Babylonia and circle Babylonia, and then Assyria and circle Assyria. Persia captured both of those people. This represents the shift in power during the exile period. Assyria had conquered Israel, then Babylonia conquered Assyria and Judah, and finally Persia conquers Babylonia, and they ended up ruling everyone, not everyone. So now it's Persia's place. All right, so the test, the exile test you can do on 43, that's just filling in those blanks you just did. The more you do this, the more you will know it. And you'll be able to recite it on our last day. Okay, so now we're moving to the return period. On page 45, look down at the bottom. Let me change my slide. Is it up here? The return period, it's Ezra. Let's read it. Return, Ezra, Jerusalem, Ezra leads the people back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, so the prophets had prophesied that Babylon is going to be in captivity for 70 years, so they knew they were going to get to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So, page 46, 4 major subjects in the return period. It should say period, not era. The return period. The first one is disrepair, destruction from war and neglect. You can read about that in Nehemiah. The prophets had prophesied that Babylonia was going to be in captivity for 70 years, and they were, so they knew they were going to go back. But Jerusalem had been totally leveled. The temple had been destroyed. Everything had been torn down or burned. Total destruction in Jerusalem. That was 586 BC. Jerusalem had fallen into a state of abject ruin during those 70 years of neglect. It looked pretty bad. So the Jews had relied on the temple for worship and sacrifice, and the temple was gone. Their worship on Jehovah was based on the temple. So Jerusalem was in total disrepair. So number 2, the temple, they're going to rebuild the temple in Ezra 1-6. So Cyrus was the king of Persia, and God softened his heart in a miraculous way and said, you can go back and rebuild your temple into Jerusalem. And not only did he soften his heart to let them go back, he helped finance the adventure. So he allowed some of the Jews to go back in shifts to rebuild the temple. So now we're rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed when the Babylonians had captured the southern kingdom. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, he was a notable Jewish figure in Persia. The temple was rebuilt. So Zerubbabel helped in the rebuilding of the temple, and it wasn't a grand temple. Some of them cried when they saw it because it wasn't beautiful like the Temple of Solomon. But it was a temple for them to worship, and they could worship again. Okay, so now their temple is being rebuilt. Now we need to rebuild the people. They've been in exile for 70 years, and so Ezra was the one who led that. While Zerubbabel was rebuilding the temple, Ezra was rebuilding God's people and their faith and their spiritual lives. The whole time they'd been in captivity, they didn't have the law. They didn't read the law. They had nowhere to worship. A generation had been into captivity. Most hadn't even seen or heard the law. So Ezra began, I love Ezra. Should have named one of my sons Ezra. Ezra began to rebuild their spiritual lives by reading the law to them, and they wept as they heard him read. He set up this podium, he began to read the law, and their spiritual lives, he discipled them in the law of the covenant. There was a spiritual rebuilding of the temple and a physical rebuilding of the temple. They had a place to worship, and then Ezra came along and rebuilt their lives spiritually. They had to relearn what it meant to be a Jew. Okay, then point 4, the walls. Restoration complete. So the temple's built, but a city is not a city unless it has walls. The walls represented security, and it was their way they fought off enemies. To have your walls torn down is very humiliating. So the walls needed to be rebuilt. A city without walls is nothing. They had a temple, but they had no protection, the walls around their city. So Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer of the king. Cupbearer means he ate and drank before the king's food, in case someone had poisoned it. The cupbearer would die and not the king. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king, and he was deeply burdened to rebuild the walls. And Artaxerxes gives Nehemiah the permission to go and build the walls, and he also financially supported that. It's really a miracle of God. They had finance, they had permission to go rebuild the wall, and the financing to do it. And they did it in 52 days. Nehemiah was brilliant. He had the people build their wall in front of their houses. So they wanted it done right. They wanted it done fast. They wanted it to look good. So the people built the wall around the city where they lived in their neighborhood. So they worked hard and did a good job. So the restoration is complete. The return era is complete. So they were exiled for 70 years. They come back. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild their spiritual lives. They rebuild their covenant with God. And then they put their fortified walls around their city, and Jerusalem was ready for action again. All right, so now turn the page to the map of the geography of the return period. Pretty easy. Draw an arrow from Persia to Jerusalem. They left, Persia had rights over all of these people. Let them go back to Jerusalem to rebuild their city. Okay. We have one more period in the entire Old Testament, and that was the silent period. So the return period of test, you can fill that out, and I encourage you to do it so you can memorize it, because there's going to be a big test on the last day. And if you don't pass, you have to sit through this class again. It's an open book, yeah, open book. My daughter had a lot of open book tests in college, and they were not easy, you know. It was one time, I'm going off the subject again, but one time she took this history class, and my husband is huge history. He knows everything about history, you know. And, you know, my history teacher, again, was my high school football coach. I knew nothing. And so, but you could take this open book test as many times as you wanted. And it was but it was a different test every time. Some of the questions would be the same. And so Earl said, give me that test. I'm taking it. You know, he made a 70, you know. I'm going to go over there and talk, you know. So open book tests are not easy, but this one is easy. So it's all written in the words between you. Okay, so the silence period. Look at everything we've walked through. We've walked through God creating the earth. We walked through Abraham listening to the call of God and going to Canaan. We see where Joseph went to Egypt and all of his family followed. They multiplied into millions of people, and Moses leads them out, and they get to Canaan. They wander around forever, and finally they all die off, and Joshua finally leads a conquest, and they conquest the promised land. It becomes theirs. They live there. Then they said, we want some rulers. They got judges who were evil, bad people. They ruled. They did a lot of dumb stuff. They disobeyed God. And then they said, we want kings. So they give them kings. And they were bad kings. And there was so much division. The whole area divided, the north and the south, and they all got taken over by foreign powers. And then they got sent into exile for 70 years. Now they've come back, and they're in Jerusalem. And this is where we find the New Testament. We're back in Jerusalem. The walls have been built. Everything is ready and set up for the Messiah. What the Old Testament has pointed to, all of those books pointed to the coming of the one who is going to redeem us. And all of that leads up. But there was a period for 400 years that nothing is recorded. The portrait is God is silent for 400 years, meaning no prophecies, nothing's written down, no books are written, no scrolls, nothing. It happens for these 400 years, but God is still working. And the Pharisees entrenched the Israelites in legalism. Okay, so here we are in the silent period, and there's 4 major subjects during this silent period. The first is the changing guard, the march of nations. At the close of the Old Testament, Jerusalem was ruled by Persia. Now, during this silent time, during these 400 years, a lot of stuff happened. And we know this happened. It's not written in the Bible or prophesied, but we know this happened because of history. This is history. In 333 BC, Alexander the Great, the Greek, defeated the Persians. People were constantly conquering other nations. The Greeks defeated the Persians, and Greek became the prominent culture and language during this 400 years where nothing is written biblically. So Persia becomes Greek, was defeated by the Greeks, and now Rome defeats the Greeks, and they conquer that part of the world. So now it's a Roman culture. There was Roman influence, but the Greek culture continued through this entire time, and it was a good thing. So Rome conquers the Greeks, but the culture continues, and the Romans speak Greek. Everyone speaks the same language. Okay, so then the political sects during this time, there were two of them, the Maccabees and the Zealots. They were militant Jews that fought to make Israel an independent country. A zealot is like someone's very passionate, is fanatic about something, like UT fans that paint their face orange and wear those lovely checkerboard overalls. You know, those people are zealots about UT football. So the Jewish zealots are those that wanted Israel to be an independent country. They were the far right-wing people. They wanted to fight against the Roman rule. They wanted Israel to be separate and independent instead of being, they wanted ruled by the Romans. They did not want Roman rule. They were constantly rebelling and revolting against it. And then the Maccabees, they was also listed there on number 2. They were your militant Jews. They were the ones that fought. And the Rome pretty much massacred all of them in their fighting. Rome would crush the rebellion, and they would crucify all the military leaders and the zealots. There were some zealots still left over when Jesus was around, like Simon the Zealot. Okay, so then there were political sects. There were also religious sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You know, we heard about them in in Sunday school. There were two religious sects, Pharisees and the Sadducees. Unfortunately, both of them were pretty much spiritually bankrupt. They promoted religious traditions, but they were devoid of the truth, the true faith. The Pharisees were like the conservative party, the Orthodox. They wanted to be separate from society. The Sadducees were like the liberal party and that part of the aristocracy, the wealth. They used their money to keep the status quo, to keep the waters calm. And there was one religious difference. The Pharisees believed in the final resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees did not. And that became an issue when Jesus said he was coming back in 3 days. So another sect was the ruling board, the Sanhedrin. It was representatives from the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They came together, this ruling board. And the one thing that the Sanhedrin developed was this antagonism against Jesus that happened in the New Testament. So what the Pharisees did, where it says they kept entrenched the Israelites in legalism, they kept adding to the law. So you couldn't do it, you could only walk so many steps on Sunday. There were 613 laws extra laws that they wrote that were impossible to keep. How many steps you could take on Sunday. If you were in a room with a dead person, you became unclean. So many laws that they could not keep. Keeping the law became impossible. And Jesus, later on in the Sermon on the Mount, he rebuked this. And he said, love trumps this. He says, I came to fulfill that law. And then the last point in our Old Testament is the messianic hope, the expectation of a Savior. And I do remember someone, I don't know what I did with that card, but someone did ask me about, yes, Jesus wasn't the fulfillment Messiah for the Jews. And we'll hear about that. So during the silent years, one of the biggest developments was the rise of the Roman Empire. They conquered the world. The Roman Empire conquered the world. But they did 3 great things that were going to help promote Christianity down the road. Number 1, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. There was no fighting in Rome, in that area, for roughly 400 years. And they made a road system. They built roads. Wherever there was a Roman settlement, roads were built so you could travel easily in the area. And they made Greek the language of the world. So all of it was setting up when Christianity was born, when that messianic hope came, could be easily spread around the world. And here we are, 2,000 plus years later, still talking about it, still spreading it. Because of the gospel could be shared in one common language, the Greek, and people could travel easily without being fear of getting lost or people coming and attacking them. They had the roads, and there was peace. So the Pax Romana, the Roman road system, and the Greek language all helped pave the road for the Messiah. The Messiah had been prophesied throughout the Old Testament as a deliverer, and this is why maybe the Jews did not accept him, because they were expecting a physical deliverer that was going to fight against Roman rule. But we know when Jesus came, that was not the case. They were looking for a political leader who could overthrow the oppression of Rome, the expectation of a Savior. They were sick of Roman domination. So they waited with hope for their Messiah to come, but he didn't come for 400 years. And that leads us to the New Testament. An interesting thing that I read where Daniel had prophesied in chapter 9 that 483 years after the decree to rebuild the temple, that the Messiah would come. And exactly 483 years after the temple began to be rebuilt, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday. Pretty amazing stuff. So, the Old Testament, we break out of the silent period with John the Baptist coming on the scene. Ree, were you raising your hand? Repeat what? About the prophecy? Oh, okay, so it's in Daniel 9. I think it's in Daniel 9. He prophesied that 483 years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, not the temple, but rebuild Jerusalem, maybe it is the temple, I don't know, the Messiah would come. And 483 years after they started the rebuilding Jerusalem, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday. So, pretty cool stuff. So, that concludes, we got to do our map, sorry. 52, our map. Y'all know so much about geography now. I do. Okay, so this is the geography of the silent period. Put a 1 next to Persia. And then they were overtaken by the Greeks, so put a 2 by Greece. And then Rome conquered them and put a 3 by Rome. That represents a geographical movement of the silent period. A lot of things happened during those 400 years that we know from history. We know that's what happens. And it sets up, they're waiting for the Messiah for 400 years during all of this, waiting for that promised Messiah that was going to be their deliverer. So you can do the silent silence period test this week. You have 3 of those you need to do. So by next week you should know all of the Old Testament. You know all of the Old Testament now. So it's like you know the historical movement, the history of the Old Testament. We still got to look at the prophecy books and the poetical books. But you know the history of the Old Testament in just 4 weeks. Y'all are overachievers. So, okay. So, yes, ma'am. You know, I don't have a date. I didn't write. Oh, return period. Yes, I do. So the silence period was 400 years after. The return period was, maybe I didn't say it, 538 BC. So if you have questions about anything from Genesis through the history of the Old Testament, write them on your card, drop them in there, and I'll research it or ask the bobsledder if I don't know. So on your table, I am leaving you so much time for your discussion. I'm so proud of myself. So on your table, you have 2 sheets. I made 2 copies for each table. Begin to walk through, start anywhere you want. You can start at the creation. You can start anywhere and work through those discussion questions together. Let me see if I have any announcements before we break. Oh, I do. Shoot, I left it at home. Patricia McCormick, one of our Bible study members' husband, passed away this last week, and I had a card for her, and I forgot to bring it. But I'll bring it next week. We can still send it. Next week is, we'll meet as normal. And then the week of October 10th, we're on fall break. And then we have 2 more weeks. So we only have 3 more weeks together. So I hope y'all come back for the last 3 weeks. So, all right. So you can start your discussion. And Tara's going to stop the recording. And we will see where we end up in 40 minutes.